Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack, and we are here for more interviews from KubeCon+CloudNativeCon in Barcelona, Spain. Joining me for our discussion today is Tom Petrocelli, Research Fellow with Amalgam. Is it Amalgam Insights? Amalgam Insights, and William Morgan, CEO of Buoyant.
Hello.
How you doing?
William, I was at this party last night, and I met someone who's one of your maintainers.
Who is that?
He works for Big Commerce.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Right, Zach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we were talking about service mesh, and he said when he first discovered Linkerd, he's like, why isn't everyone using this? Okay.
A question I ask
often. So we're buttering you up right here, so a little bit. But what he said was that he was working, he works with developers all over the world, right? Kiev, I think he said Guadalajara, even like all over, and they're all using different tools and working in different programming languages. And he saw Linkerd as a way to kind of like create that capability to kind of, sit above that, and then be able to then have that observability, into those different developer environments. Is that a key use case you're finding?
Yeah. I'm so glad you started this way. I think, so I was an engineer in a previous life, and a lot of the service mesh conversations that we have tend to be kind of these very engineering conversations around like, well, what's the feature set and when are you going to support X and Y? And in reality, what we found is what Linkerd is very good at solving, and the service mesh in general is good at solving, is actually a human problem, which is especially as a company grows or an organization grows and you have lots of people trying to do things at the same time. What Linkerd allows you to do is make the lives of developers easier, especially developers, also platform owners, by moving a lot of the functionality that they would otherwise be responsible for down to the platform layer where they don't have to worry about it.
So obviously he's an engineering manager, right? And he's working with these developers. He's leading their teams. Do you find it's as much an issue with distributed workforces as it is with teams that you're working with internally?
Yeah, I don't think it really matters, where they are located geographically. It's more about how are you operating with them, and are they all, trying to accomplish some kind of shared purpose where, we're trying to ship some new code, but we're all working on kind of independent parts of it, and we want to move as rapidly as possible. But we also have these kind of coordination points where we do have to, accomplish something together.
Is that the value that you see in service mesh?
I think there's a lot of value in service mesh. That's one of them for sure. I think there is a lot of technical value in it.
Sure.
One of the things that has happened because of this move towards microservices and container clusters is centralized resources, like centralized networking resources, are just not designed for that environment. They're not designed for that very highly distributed environment. So we've started to move more and more into the actual, say, Kubernetes pod or into a microservice itself. So as William was saying, that meant for a long time that you had to build that into your code. You had to write your microservice with networking code in it. And that's not what software developers do. They want to write the business logic. So what we've been able to do with Service Mesh is to create all those services that we need, those layer 7 network services. We've been able to create those without having to burden developers with it. But in the same time, we're using a more appropriate way of doing that kind of networking than, say, centralized appliances. I mean, this is one of the reasons why you're seeing companies like F5. They're doing a service mesh distribution called Aspen Mesh, and they just bought Nginx, and so they're going heavily into this cluster-based.
Through F5 bought Nginx,
right?
And Aspen Mesh is a spin-out, right? Yeah.
Well, Aspen Mesh is part of F5, so they're both part of F5 now. So what you see is a company who makes appliances now saying we need to be in the market for in-cluster network services.
They realize that the way that people are building software is changing
right.
dramatically.
Right.
Yeah, and the service mesh, so I come at this from a very particular angle, which I'm kind of an open source, nerd, and at least early on, I did not have a lot of understanding of like how enterprises work together. I was mostly kind of a startup guy, so it's been quite educational, to kind of encounter that world, and that's why the thing that makes it so interesting to me is the human factor, where a lot of the features that Linkerd can accomplish for you. So normally we talk about things like reliability and security and observability. And for each of those aspects, Linkerd is not the complete solution, right? We can't be a complete security solution, but we can be a big part of it. We can't be a complete reliability solution, but we can accomplish a big part of it. And the parts that Linkerd can accomplish are things that are naturally platform features, right? They're things that are independent of business logic, like Tom said. They're things that are hard to get right. So even something like, how do I retry this request when something fails? It's quite nuanced to get that right in a big distributed system. And they're also things that work best when they're applied uniformly across the stack. So those three features are all kind of characteristic of things that should be platform features rather than developer features.
That's right. And this is also why the announcement last night about SMI is so important, because we do have a diverse landscape in Service Mesh, and there's a lot of opportunity for all kinds of other things to be layered on top of it. It might be AI for controlling some of the network functions, or it might be just like better visualizations for some of the telemetry that you can now get out of the network. And by having a common interface, it means that developers, either in-house developers or vendors, have opportunities to build these new services on top of Service Mesh, if you will, and not have to know everybody's individual APIs.
Yeah, I loved that. I loved the demos that he gave. There was one from Flagger, which is this very cool open source project from Weave, which does basically a blue-green deploy, but looks at the success rate metrics of the new code that's going out, and if the success rate is going down, then it undoes the deploy. Like that's exactly what you should be doing, and it's a layer that sits on top of the service mesh, and he uses the service mesh to accomplish basically a business objective, right? And there was one around KubeCost, which was a tool for measuring the utilization of how much money you're spending on each of these calls, and it built on top of the service mesh to give you that number on a per request basis. You can say, oh, this API endpoint is actually costing me 33 cents every time someone calls it. Like that kind of ecosystem building around the service mesh, I think is really exciting.
Right, and that's hard to do given the diversity of solutions out there. So if you're in the Linkerd world, well, that's great if that's all you want to do. But
it's the best world.
And as we said, there's nothing wrong with that. but as we said, there's a lot of diversity in programming languages. But a lot of these teams are choosing their own service meshes as well. So when you want to get sort of the bird's eye view, it's really hard to do because your tools wouldn't line up. SMI is going to help that a lot. Yeah. And this is what products like SoloIO's Glue does, I should say. And in fact, a lot of what we saw last night was based on that. So anyway, I thought that was actually an important announcement. I'm glad we had a chance to see it.
Yeah, I was really excited to see it.
And you got a shout out.
Yeah. Well, we've been heavily involved. We've been lucky to be heavily involved in defining that spec, in a way that makes a lot of sense. For coming at it from the perspective of someone who is then going to have to implement that spec in Linkerd.
Right. Yeah, I'm wondering about that. What were kind of the priorities you set in that definition?
Yeah, so it's never easy to do something like this, and in a sense, the spec, any kind of spec like this will be kind of a trailing or a lagging function of all the functionality that the service mesh ecosystem itself is exploring. But what we tried to do with SMI was to capture kind of the core mechanics. It's certainly not everything that every service mesh can do, and Linkerd can definitely do a lot of different things that's not captured by the spec. But what we ended up settling on were an API around getting observability or metrics data out of the service mesh, because that's definitely one of the core components. An API for doing traffic shifting, so doing things like blue-green deploys, which is why the Flagger demo was so cool, and then an API around setting policy, so saying, hey, A is not allowed to talk to B, or A is allowed to talk to B. Yeah, and that's a starting point. There's a lot more that I think the spec will eventually encompass. But I think we're trying to find the balance there between, having a set of the core functionality that everyone kind of agrees should be part of it, but also letting individual service meshes explore that space because it's still very early.
Right, and that's part of the reason there is so much diversity, because there's lots of different types of applications out there, and different applications, different services have different service mesh needs. So in some cases, one product or project provides something that another doesn't, and vice versa. And when you have that, one of the beauties of this sort of cluster-based architecture is that you can do what you need to do in each. You don't have to make a single bet. You don't have to make a single bet on language. You don't have to make a single bet on product or software platform component. However, the problem of managing diversity is a tough one, which is why this was very cool to hear.
Yeah. And then, the thing that I'm always worried about, again, coming into this as an engineer is kind of death by committee, or the best way to stifle any kind of innovation is to put a spec around it, and now we can't make any progress until the 13 people who are on this committee all agree, and that's going to take 7 months.
And that has its effects. So we've seen that happen.
Yeah, and I don't want to be anywhere near that situation with Linkerd. So with SMI, I think we've done a pretty good job of making that an explicit, thing that we're going to avoid, and setting up the governance and kind of the approach and the philosophy in a way that, again, we can get the core stuff in there, but still allow for the diversity of service mesh implementation.
Yeah, the word standard is a very dirty word around
here.
Oh
yeah. Don't say that. That's a yes word.
But we see with a lot of these, the governance of these organizations is critical to, kind of in the terms of the success of the organization.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, that kind of speaks to some of the value that the CNCF can provide too, is, one of the reasons why it was so important for us to have Linkerd be a CNCF project is because we wanted it to be part of this open, foundation that had some guidelines that end users could trust around kind of the governance of the project and how things were going to evolve. Especially, any popular open source project over time, kind of naturally, there are contributors who come in, there are contributors who leave, people move on, and you want to have a sense of okay, Linkerd is going to be around. What the CNCF can provide is the fact that Linkerd is going to be around for a while.
And this kind of very much open source, open governance. When we think of open source, there's a lot of, I'll back to that word diversity, there's a lot of different ways that you can run an open source project, and we hear a lot about things like open core, where the open source project is pretty much run and owned by a corporation. Right now, I'm starting to see more and more end users or more and more folks who are buying, looking at an open source project, and truly open governance is a checklist item. They're not as interested in open core because it's vendor lock-in just like it always is. If you want to be able to have choice going forward, you don't want to be working with an open source project that's really controlled by one or maybe two companies.
Yeah, and being part of the CNCF, I think, is a big step in that direction, right? Because it makes it clear what the governance kind of guidelines are going to be.
But you do still see the governance of open source projects being dominated by certain companies. I mean, the one I've been studying is Knative, and the steering committee is all Google, and the technical oversight committee is then Google plus IBM and Red Hat. How does your governance add up?
Yeah, so for us, we are in the situation where for Linkerd, it is a CNCF project. The primary contributors continue to be from one company, namely my company, Buoyant, because we've done a very good job of finding people who are making really good contributions around the world and then saying, hey, do you want to do this, in exchange for money? We really like what you're doing. Can we just fund you to do this full time? Because, so I think it's a little bit myopic to just say, oh, these are all coming from one company, because we're highly incentivized to set up these relationships where people who are contributing, get kind of a wage or get value in exchange for that. But I think it also depends on the size of the project. Early on, and I think the world is becoming a lot more comfortable with the fact that early on, a lot of open source is coming out of a single company, right? And once the project matures, well, then you want to have a little more diversity in there. But early on, it's not like the days of Linux where, open source was primarily driven by this hobbyist angle who really had no mechanism, other than, spending their nights and weekends doing this to build something. Now, I think in part thanks to the VC ecosystem, but also in part to other social dynamics that are changing, a lot of open source projects start from companies and go on to be very, very successful.
That seems to be the model.
Yeah.
So in terms of the understanding about service mesh, how would you gauge it now? How would you gauge that overall understanding?
Oh man. I would characterize it as massive awareness and very little understanding. And so it's interesting. So we, Linkerd was the very first service mesh. We were the ones who coined that term, and that early, those early years were very much us evangelizing this service mesh model. We were going out there and we were saying, hey, look, service mesh is this thing, it's a new thing. You never heard the term, but listen, it's really important. And no one really wanted to hear that, right? Like, you've got 50 things you're already thinking about, and you're like, yeah, I have to think about number 51 now, like, go away. That conversation has totally changed over the past maybe 18 months, where now everyone we talk to knows what a service mesh is. They even know that it's important. They know that the service mesh exists, and they know that it's important, but they don't really know what it is. And in some ways it's better, right? We have to do a little less evangelization. In some ways it's a lot worse because there's a whole lot of attention, and you have to pick apart, at least from the perspective of someone who I want to make people successful with this. So I have to pick apart who actually has problems that we can solve, and who is doing it because they feel like they're gonna lose out unless they adopt a service mesh.
How do you distinguish?
Well, we've gotten very good at asking certain questions, like, okay, what problem are you trying to solve? Yeah. And if you can get a cogent explanation of that, right, and it maps up with something that Linkerd can actually solve, then great, let's continue. If not, then let me point you in a different direction, and we won't waste your time, and you won't waste our time, and you'll end up being successful. And you don't need a service mesh. That's fine. That's okay. Not everyone needs it right now.
I mean, part of what I'm seeing though is that because we live our lives in this particular community, not only service mesh but Kubernetes and container clusters, we tend to overthink or overemphasize the adoption. Right. I mean, I do personally believe we're on the cusp of mainstream adoption, but none of this is mainstream yet. So in the wider world, people who aren't into clusters and things yet, service mesh isn't on the radar yet. Right. But that's because they're just learning what a container is and what a Kubernetes platform is and blah, blah, blah. But they quickly do move into these other areas, especially service mesh being one of the first ones. So once you stand up your first couple of clusters, you start to think to yourself, well, how am I going to solve some of these other problems? And then they come to the service mesh thing they've heard of. Right. I do think you're right, though. There's a lot of people who have, read an article or read a paper or something, and they're convinced that this thing called service mesh is something you always have to have. I don't think that's true, but I think when you start to stand up large clusters, I think when you start to have more extensive applications, especially applications that you're auto scaling and things like that, yeah, those then you're going to naturally just kind of find your way towards that.
Yeah, 100%.
Service mesh.
You will need a service mesh in that situation. I think the service mesh in particular has seen a huge amount of marketing and buzz around it.
Oh God,
and so it's like particularly bad right now. It is something that you are going to need, but people are being exposed to it, and it's not really good for the community. It's a little unfortunate. Yeah.
But it's part of the journey.
It is.
I guess so.
But there's a lot of newbies out there, and that's cool. There's so many new people here at this conference.
Yeah, which is
that's
great.
Really great, too.
Really cool.
It shows that we're on that road to mainstream adoption. In a few years, I think all of this stuff is going to be very, very mainstream, very much what everybody's doing, not just your digital companies or your real tech-forward companies. It's just going to become normalized. But and at that point, things like service mesh will be normal conversations. Yeah. It won't be anything exotic.
It'll be boring.
It'll start to get down to not should I have a service mesh, but which particular project or product offers me the exact features that I need for what I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
I don't think people are there yet. I don't think in general.
So how do you view the landscape? How, Linkerd is, has a lot of peers in the community.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of diversity in the landscape, and that's...
So maybe you could explain that diversity a little bit.
So there's, I mean, when you look at a service mesh, I basically look at it in three ways. You have what's called the data plane, which actually does all the networking stuff. And then you have the control plane, which manages things like policies, kind of slurps up the telemetry from the observability features, things like that. And then there's other services that are being built on it. So there's a lot of different data planes. There's a lot of proxies out there. Linkerd's, Envoy, Nginx, those are probably the most common ones that people hear. And then on the control plane side, you have Linkerd. You also have Istio, and there's a lot of buzz around Istio. It's almost become self-referential. All these vendors are pushing Istio, and because they're pushing Istio, other vendors think they have to be there. So it's
FOMO.
Yeah,
some real FOMO.
So it's kind of spiraling out of control. No, it's not really. But then you also have lots of other folks in there. You have HashiCorp's Console. You have A10. There's lots of folks doing that part of it. And then there's all these other features. We already mentioned Solo.io, Vamp. There's a bunch of other companies out there that are doing some of these more advanced features on top of it. The problem, though, with that is it makes choosing hard. I mean, it's great to have choice, but sometimes when you have too many choices, it can be really difficult to determine what's your best choice for any particular situation. I think that's where this market's going to have to get a little better defined pretty soon.
For your own purposes, William, how do you then keep track of the landscape to help yourself just continue to process what is being prioritized, not just by you, but your peers?
Yeah, so to a certain extent, I don't care about the landscape. Like, what I care about is, there's a big audience of Kubernetes users out there, and we focus very heavily on Kubernetes, and they have a set of problems, and I want Linkerd to be the best solution for those, not all the problems, but for the class of problems that it can solve. And by best, I mean I want it to be, I want it to solve problems in a very direct way, and I also want the cost of adopting Linkerd to be really small, because everything's an investment, right? Everything's, you got to measure it in terms of ROI. So if the return is really high, if the R is really high, well, that's great, and there's a lot of conversation about, the value prop of the service mesh and how we give you all these cool telemetry features, but then there's also the investment, right? Like, what price are we paying to add this to our stack? Right. And there's a price both in kind of the computational cost, okay, how much memory is it going to consume and how many CPUs and how hard does a computer have to work? I think the more important part there is actually what latency is it going to introduce, like how is it going to impact my application? But then there's also the cost, and this is even more important, of like, what are the human beings who have to operate this thing going to have to pay, right? And this is where I think you start seeing a little bit of differentiation in the service mesh offerings. We've just adopted Kubernetes, right? You have to be a little empathetic, right? Here's this poor person who's just adopted Kubernetes. Got this huge API surface area. They're like, okay, you can give all this stuff, which is great, but man, they're living a new lifestyle now. And then now we're asking them to adopt this other thing on top of it. So the goal for Linkerd is to reduce that computational, the cognitive burden as much as possible. Give you the value of the service mesh without it feeling like, it's this massive layer of infrastructure that I just have to layer on top of the other massive layer of infrastructure.
So when did you start the project?
Linkerd actually started in the very ancient days of 2016.
Okay, so it's 2019 right now.
Yeah.
What were so if you're going to look at priorities now compared to then, and then looking forward to priorities going future, what would be some of your comparisons?
Yeah, that's a great question. So 2016, that landscape, even the orchestration landscape, was pretty diverse back then, and Linkerd 1.x continues, which we continue to maintain, supports Mesos and Nomad and Console and Marathon and Kubernetes, and we tried to make 1.x really this kind of integration platform with with 2.x, which is where a lot of the effort in the Linkerd world is spent today, we're really heavily focused on Kubernetes. And I'd say the core value props are the same, right? In all cases, we've been really focused on telemetry and reliability and security. But the big change that we have gone through in the past 3 years is 100% on reducing the cognitive burden of adopting Linkerd and also the computational burden. So how do we give you all that value without it being complicated, without you having to spend 3 months reading through some documentation to understand all these new things? Can we just turn it on by default?
Yeah, and that's a common problem just in this whole market, in the container market, Kubernetes market. There's a lot of, as you say, cognitive overload. You get tired of writing YAML files until your fingers fall off. You get tired of endless command lines. And part of the trend we're seeing right now, which is really super positive, is towards automation. There's an understanding amongst the open source community that the things that worked a few years ago when this was super new and everybody was hiring legions of engineers to do some really basic stuff doesn't work anymore. It all has to be much more simple and much more automated for mainstream adoption. And that's one of the big trends that we're seeing right now in this space, is that more automation, even a little bit of AI getting sprinkled in there in order to make your average platform engineer's life easier.
Yeah. And I think it's a natural evolution. Like when you get into this, you're an engineer and you're like, okay, I'm going to have all these features and we're going to build this, we're going to build a platform and we're going to have all these things. And then at some point you start talking to other human beings who are trying to use this, and hopefully you develop a little bit of empathy and you're like, oh man, like this poor person, like, they really had to struggle hard to do this. And then you go through this transformation where you say, okay, well, how do I actually try and let's get to the solution as rapidly as possible rather than providing a platform for all possible solutions.
But to your point before, then it comes down to cost. If I've got to go hire 25 engineers in order to implement Kubernetes, just to implement my service mesh and all that, then it's a different discussion than if I can just push a button and it goes, right? If I have all this additional headcount cost just to maintain this new environment, it's really hard then to justify that cost versus what I'm going to get out of it.
Can I just say one of the things that I'm really, really proud of with Linkerd, and we did this keynote video, on Tuesday morning, where with Linkerd 2.3, we enable mutual TLS between services by default. Right. So you install Linkerd, which takes about 30 seconds, and the moment that you add a service to the data plane, it is wrapped in mutual TLS. We ship with a certificate authority. It provisions. These TLS certificates are tied to Kubernetes service accounts. You don't have to do anything.
That's right.
And I find that I find that kind of emotionally very satisfying, because it feels like that kind of security should be available by default. When I use my web browser and I look at Reddit cat pictures or whatever, I have that green lock, right? Which means that the cat pictures are being encrypted and the government cannot sniff them, or whatever it means, and I don't have to do any work.
Right, and that's a great analogy, because if you think about it, there's so much of our technology right now, and the web browser is a great example. There's all this stuff under the covers, but could you imagine asking folks every time, do you want TLS? I mean, now
type in some YAML.
Right. Type up some YAML, write a configuration file. That wouldn't work. And honestly, for developers, it's not any different, because again, what they're doing is not trying to do all this networking stuff. What they want to do is just write their business logic. They want to write their code. Right. And if they have to be doing all this other stuff, then it's too burdensome. And that burden equals cost. Yeah, and that cost will make the ROI on your cluster architecture not as good as it should be.
I almost see it as like a democratization issue, where it's like, if the cost is high, then only the companies that have a lot of money, or the organizations that are very well financed, will be able to do this. And there's no reason why only the big companies get to have security. Like, everyone should have security.
Right. And it's not even just that they have to be big companies. They have to be folks with a lot of free cash that they're spending on technology. Right. So your average company, again, we come back to mainstream adoption. Service mesh is not going to gain mainstream adoption, and all these clusters won't gain mainstream adoption if it's too expensive to do. because it's too hard to do. But again, I see hope on the horizon. I see a lot more, let's make this the default. I see that.
Right.
And I see a lot of automation, like, well, let's make installation instead of 12 steps, just one command and bang, you go. That's really, really useful. I'm a total believer in less YAML, please.
So what version are you on now with Linkerd?
2.3 was released last month.
When's the next major release then?
We're expecting 2.4 to be out next month.
Is that a major release then?
Yes, yeah.
What's
that's right.
major about it then?
Yeah, so typically we divide Linkerd into edge releases, which we're doing almost weekly, which is if you want to live on the bleeding edge. And then the major releases, which we do about every 6 weeks, are things that we expect to be stable and have a lot more guarantees around them. So we typically we'll roll out new functionality. Edge release, our community will do a lot of testing. The community will run a bunch of testing, and then if things are looking good, we roll it into a stable release.
So what was in the last edge release?
Yeah, so 2.3, the big shift, the big item for us was mutual TLS on by default with 0 config. So you do not have to do anything, press a button, and everything works. For 2.4, we are adding traffic shifting and SMI support, which means you'll be able to drive blue-green deploys. You can kind of do blue-green deploys now through Kubernetes by flipping labels on pods, but there's a bunch of reasons why that's not ideal. So you want to do it at the service mesh level where you get very fine-grained support. So we'll have that next month, and we'll have SMI support.
So Tom, for a last question, what are you looking for to keep that hope alive in the overall community?
Again, just more automation, more default, things enabled by default. I think that's the evolution that needs to happen. I think we need to get away from installs that take 5 commands and it's 2 curls and then a whole series of other commands. You can't do that. It's too burdensome. You need to get down to one-click install, and I see that happening, and that's good. I think more value-added services on top of all of this service mesh. I'd be a real fan of really cool visualizations that help you understand what your traffic really looks like. So how do you shape traffic if you don't know what your traffic looks like? And if what you're getting is a bunch of numbers that's hard to see, then that doesn't work. So there's companies out there doing that. And again, I think a lot more of this, these integration layers like SMI. I think those are all what keep hope alive.
Great. Well, thank you both for taking the time. William, Tom, have a great show, and we look forward to talking soon.
Thanks.
Thanks. It was a good time.